Hey there. Tonight we're going to explore the brutal life of a Viking sailor. A journey far from the heroic sagas and into the cold, wet reality of the open sea. As you settle in, ready to unwind, we welcome you. It's always so wonderful to know where our fellow history travelers are settling in for the night. So feel free to leave a comment with where you're listening from. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, consider subscribing to join our crew. We're about to discover what it truly meant to be a tiny speck of wood and wool on a vast and unforgiving ocean. So, just breathe and picture yourself on a rocky shore long before the sun has decided to rise. The air is cold. It smells of salt and wet stone. And in the distance, a long, slender shadow rests upon the dark water. It's a particular kind of cold that finds you here, in the half-light of a 9th century morning. It's not the sharp, dry cold of a winter's day, but a damp, penetrating chill that seems to seep into your bones from the gray mist rolling off the fjord. You can taste it on your tongue, a mixture of sea salt, pine resin from the great forests that crowd the steep hillsides, and the distant, reassuring smell of wood smoke from the longhouse behind you, where the embers of last night's fire are still faintly glowing. This is the edge of your world, but it is about to become the beginning of a new one. Down on the pebbled shore, bobbing gently with the turning tide, is the reason for this early rising. It's a ship, but to call it just a ship feels like a disservice, like calling a cathedral just a building. It is a promise, a threat, a vessel of ambition, and for the next few months, it will be your entire world, a sliver of known reality in a vast, unknowable sea. These ships, the iconic longships, were the key that unlocked the world for the Norse people. They were not just raiders, as the terrified monks of Lindisfarne would have you believe. They were explorers, merchants, settlers, and mercenaries. Their journeys were astonishing in their scope, reaching from the ice-flecked shores of North America, which they called Vinland, all the way to the gilded heart of the Byzantine Empire, which they knew as Miklagard, the great city. And every single one of those journeys, whether for plunder or for trade, began just like this. On a cold shore, with a longship waiting patiently in the water, its dragon-headed prow pointed towards the open horizon, the life of a Viking sailor was, to put it mildly, brutal. It was a relentless assault on the senses and a profound test of human endurance. Before the glory, before the silver and the sagas, there was the grueling, monotonous, and terrifying reality of the voyage itself. Forget the cinematic depictions of brawny, laughing men effortlessly conquering the waves. The truth was far more mundane and far more harrowing. It was a life lived in a state of perpetual dampness, of gnawing hunger, and of a deep, abiding cold that sleep offered little respite from. It was a life of calloused hands, aching backs, and eyes raw from staring into the glare of the sun on the water or squinting into the teeth of a gale. And it all began with the ship itself. These were not mass-produced vessels. Each one was a masterpiece of craft, a culmination of generations of boat-building knowledge passed down from father to son, from master to apprentice. They were typically made from oak, a wood prized for its strength and resistance to rot. A shipwright, a man like old Einar, with hands as gnarled as the roots of the trees he worked, would spend a lifetime learning to read the grain of the wood, to know instinctively which tree would yield the perfect keel, the single most important timber in the entire vessel. The keel was the ship's backbone, and finding a tree with the right length, strength, and natural curve was a quest in itself. Once felled, the timber was not sawn into planks as we would do today. Instead, it was split with wedges and axes, following the natural grain of the wood. This made the planks, or strakes, incredibly strong and flexible, far more so than sawn boards. It was a laborious, time-consuming process, but it was this flexibility that allowed the longship to ride the waves, to bend and twist with the motion of the ocean rather than fighting against it. It made the ship feel alive, a living creature that danced with the sea instead of trying to bludgeon its way through it. This understanding of the material, this deep, almost spiritual connection to the wood, was the first secret to their success. Before a single sailor set foot on the deck, the spirit of endurance was already built into the very bones of the ship. The construction of a drakkar, The great dragon ship used for raiding and war was a communal effort, an investment of an entire village's resources and time. Picture a clearing on the edge of the fjord, filled with the rhythmic sounds of shipbuilding, the sharp thwack of axes splitting logs, the percussive tap-tap-tap of hammers on iron rivets, the hiss of hot tar being applied to seal the hull. The air is thick with the scent of fresh-cut oak, a clean, almost sweet smell, mingled with the acrid aroma of the forge where a blacksmith is painstakingly crafting hundreds, sometimes thousands, of iron rivets. Each plank of the hull overlapped the one below it, a style known as clinker-built. And where the planks met, they were fastened with these iron rivets, clenched tight over square iron washers, or roves, on the inside of the hull. Between the overlapping strakes, they would caulk the seams to make them waterproof. This wasn't some modern silicone sealant from a tube. It was a messy, smelly, but effective concoction of animal hair, often from sheep or goats, mixed with pine tar. You can imagine a young boy, perhaps named Finn, his hands and tunic smeared with the sticky black substance, his job to press this mixture deep into every single crack and seam, ensuring the vessel was as watertight as human ingenuity could make it. It was not a perfect system. These ships always leaked, a fact of life that the crew would become intimately familiar with. But it was good enough to cross an ocean. The shape of the ship was its genius. Long, narrow, and with a shallow draft, meaning its hull didn't sit very deep in the water. This design made it incredibly fast and agile. The shallow draft was a strategic masterstroke. It meant a longship could sail right up a river, deep into enemy territory, far beyond coastal defenses. It could land directly on a beach, allowing its crew to disembark and attack with terrifying speed and surprise. There was no need for a deep harbor. Any gently sloping beach would do. This was the key to the hit-and-run tactics that made the Vikings so feared. They could appear as if from nowhere, strike, and vanish back into the sea before a proper defense could be mounted. For trade, they used a different kind of vessel, the Nar. It was shorter, wider, and deeper than a longship, with more space for cargo and less for warriors. It was the workhorse of the Viking Age, the container ship of its day, carrying timber from Norway, wool from England, walrus ivory from Greenland, and silver from the Arab world. But the principles of its construction, the clinker-built hull, the reliance on the wind and the oar, were the same. The life for a sailor on a Nar was perhaps slightly less glamorous, more focused on profit than plunder, but it was no less demanding, no less brutal in its exposure to the elements. Once the hull was complete, the final touches were added. A single, large mast was raised midship, designed to hold a huge, square sail, often made of heavy wool and sometimes dyed in bright stripes of red or blue. This sail was the ship's engine. A good wind could propel a longship at speeds of up to 15 knots, a truly remarkable speed for the time. But when the wind died, there was another engine, the crew. Along the sides of the ship were the oar ports, small circular holes through which the oars could be passed. A fully manned drakkar could have over 30 pairs of oars, a line of men on each side of the vessel, their backs straining in unison to propel the ship through the calm waters of a fjord or against a stubborn current. Finally, there was the prow. On a warship, this would be carved into the terrifying head of a dragon or a serpent, its eyes glaring, its teeth bared. These weren't just for show. They were believed to possess magical properties, to ward off evil spirits of the sea, and to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. When sailing in friendly waters, it was customary to remove the dragon head, so as not to frighten the friendly spirits of the land. It was a sign of the deep-seated belief that the world was alive with unseen forces, and that to travel through it safely, one had to show the proper respect. And so, the ship is ready. The tar is cured, the sail is bent to the yardarm, the dragon head is fixed in place, its painted eyes staring out towards the sea. The supplies are loaded, and the moment of departure arrives. For the men gathering on the shore, a mix of seasoned veterans and young men tasting the salt for the first time, this ship is now their destiny. It is a vessel of hope, and it is a wooden coffin. Which it will be is a matter for the gods, the winds, and their own unyielding endurance. The process of preparing for a long voyage was a frantic, calculated effort against time and decay. The ship might be a masterpiece of engineering, but it was essentially an empty shell. It was up to the crew and their families to provision it for a journey that could last weeks or even months. The primary concern, as it is for any long-distance traveler, was food and water. And the Viking solution to this was, like their shipbuilding, both ingenious and deeply unpleasant. The staple food at sea was fish, usually cod or haddock, preserved by either salting it heavily or drying it in the wind until it was as hard as a piece of wood. This was called stockfish. You can imagine the scene in the weeks leading up to departure. The entire village smelling of fish, racks upon racks of them hanging in the open air, their bodies slowly shrinking and hardening under the pale northern sun. It was nutritious, it was lightweight, and it would last for months without spoiling. The only downside was that it was nearly inedible without extensive preparation, which was a luxury they wouldn't have at sea. More often than not, it would be chewed on raw, a tough, sinewy, and intensely salty chore for the jaw. Alongside the fish, they would have dried meat, likely mutton or goat, also heavily salted to preserve it. There might be some hard, dry flatbreads made from rye or barley, and perhaps some cheese, which kept reasonably well. But fresh vegetables or fruits were out of the question. They would rot within days. This lack of fresh produce, specifically the lack of vitamin C, meant that the specter of scurvy haunted every long voyage. The sailors wouldn't have known it was a vitamin deficiency, of course. They would have simply known that after weeks at sea, a strange and terrible illness could set in. Gums would swell and bleed, old wounds would reopen, teeth would loosen, and a profound, bone-deep lethargy would take hold. It was a miserable, debilitating condition that could easily prove fatal. Water was another critical issue. Stored in wooden barrels or leather bags, fresh water would quickly go stagnant and slimy, tasting foul and potentially causing sickness. To combat this, and to provide some much-needed calories, the other main beverage on board was ale. This wasn't the strong, hoppy ale we might think of today. It was likely a weak, low-alcohol brew made from fermented barley. It was safer to drink than stale water and provided some basic nutrition. But it was also a diuretic, meaning it makes you lose more fluid, so dehydration was a constant, nagging risk, especially during long, hot days of rowing under a clear sky. Each man would have his own small sea chest, a precious container for his personal belongings. It wouldn't hold much. A spare woolen tunic, perhaps, a sharpening stone for his axe or knife, a wooden comb, for the Vikings were surprisingly fastidious about their grooming. Maybe a gaming board with pieces carved from bone to while away the endless hours of calm. And this sea chest served another, vital purpose. It was his seat. There were no benches or bunks on a longship. The men sat on their sea chests to row, and they would huddle around them to eat. At night, they would try to sleep beside them. These chests were the one small piece of personal space each man could claim in the crowded, open confines of the ship. The loading of the ship was a carefully orchestrated chaos. Barrels of ale and water were stowed low in the center of the hull for stability. Sacks of dried fish and meat were packed in wherever they would fit. The ship's anchor, a heavy stone or a simple iron hook, was secured. The heavy, woolen sail, which doubled as a makeshift tent at night, was folded and stored, ready to be hoisted. And then there were the weapons. Shields would be hung along the gunwales, the top edges of the ship's sides. These were not just for decoration, though the brightly painted patterns did look impressive. They offered an extra layer of protection against arrows and splashes from the waves. Axes, spears, and swords were carefully stowed, oiled and sharpened, ready for use at a moment's notice. For a young man like Canute, leaving on his first voyage, the feeling must have been a potent mix of exhilarating pride and deep-seated fear. He would be leaving behind everything he had ever known. The warmth of the longhouse, the familiar faces of his family, the solid feeling of the earth beneath his feet. In exchange, he was getting a spot on a crowded plank, a diet of hard fish, and the promise of adventure or death. As the final supplies were loaded and the last farewells were said, a horn would sound. The men would push the ship out into deeper water, clambering over the sides, their boots soaked with the icy water of the fjord. The oars would be run out through the oar ports, and with a series of deep, resonant groans from the wood, the ship would begin to move, pulling away from the shore, away from the world of the living, and into the vast, gray expanse of the sea. The brutal life had begun. Life aboard a Viking longship was life lived without shelter. This is perhaps the single most difficult aspect for us to truly comprehend from our modern world of heated homes and waterproof jackets. The deck of a longship was almost entirely open to the elements. There was no cabin, no forecastle, no protected space below deck to escape the weather. The hull was filled with supplies, cargo, and the ballast stones that kept the ship stable, leaving no room for living quarters. The crew lived, worked, ate, and slept on the open deck, completely at the mercy of the sky. When the sun shone, it could be pleasant enough, a chance to dry out damp clothes and feel a touch of warmth on your skin. But the North Atlantic is not known for its sunny disposition. More often than not, the weather was a hostile force. Imagine being exposed, day and night, to a relentless, soul-sapping combination of wind and water. The wind, even on a clear day, would be a constant presence, whipping at your clothes, chilling you to the bone, and filling the air with a fine, salty spray that coated everything: your hair, your beard, your food, your bedding, with a sticky, corrosive film. There was no escaping it. It was simply the medium in which you existed. And then there was the rain. Not gentle spring showers, but hard, driving sheets of icy water that could last for days on end. With no roof over your head, you would be soaked through within minutes. Your woolen cloak, prized for its ability to insulate even when wet, would become a heavy, sodden weight on your shoulders. The deck underfoot would be slick and treacherous, and the ship itself would begin to take on water, not just from the inevitable leaks in the hull, but from the rain pouring directly into its open top. This led to one of the most hated and constant chores of a Viking sailor: bailing. Every ship carried large wooden buckets or scoops, and it was a never-ending task to keep the bilge from filling up. In shifts, day and night, men would be bent over, scooping up the sloshing, foul-smelling water in the bottom of the boat, a disgusting mixture of seawater, rainwater, and whatever other filth had accumulated, and heaving it over the side. It was back-breaking, monotonous work, performed in the cold and wet, and it never, ever stopped. It was the price of staying afloat, but worse than the rain were the waves. In a storm, the sea would cease to be a surface and would become a landscape of moving hills and valleys. The longship, for all its flexibility, was a tiny thing in the face of an Atlantic gale. Waves would crash over the sides with the force of a solid wall, sweeping across the deck and threatening to carry away anything or anyone not securely tied down. You would see a wall of dark green water rising up beside you, seeming to blot out the sky, and then a deafening roar as it broke over the ship, plunging you into a chaotic, freezing maelstrom. In those moments, survival was a matter of pure instinct, of clinging desperately to a rope, an oar, or the mast, your knuckles white, your body numb with cold, while the ship groaned and twisted beneath you. The psychological toll of this constant exposure must have been immense. There was no privacy, no moment of quiet, personal reflection. You were always in the company of dozens of other men, sharing a space no larger than a modern living room. The smells would have been overpowering: unwashed bodies, stale ale, vomit from the seasick, the ever-present stench of the bilge, and the damp, musty smell of wet wool. It was a complete sensory overload, a world stripped down to the most basic and brutal sensations of cold, wetness, and exhaustion. There was no escape. Your only hope for a brief respite was sleep, but even that was a challenge. At night, the men would huddle together for warmth, pulling their sea chests into a tighter circle. The great square sail would often be lowered and used as a communal tent, or tield, stretched over the deck, to provide a rudimentary shelter from the wind and dew. Under this, they would crawl into their sleeping bags. These weren't down-filled marvels of modern technology. They were likely made of sheepskin or leather, offering a basic barrier against the cold wooden deck. Wrapped in their cloaks, lying shoulder to shoulder with their comrades, They would try to find sleep amidst the constant motion of the ship, the creaking of the timbers, and the endless sound of the water rushing past the hull. It's likely they practiced a form of biphasic sleep, sleeping in shorter shifts rather than one long block, as someone always had to be on watch, scanning the horizon for land, for other ships, or for changes in the weather. You might drift off for a few hours, your dreams filled with the rocking of the sea, only to be shaken awake by a shipmate. Your turn to take the steering oar, or to stand watch at the prow. Your body stiff and cold, your senses immediately reassailed by the raw, untamed reality of the ocean at night. It was a life lived on the very edge of human tolerance, a world away from the sagas of glorious battle, a simple, grinding struggle for survival against the elements. And for the Viking sailor, this was just another day at the office. Navigating the open ocean in the 9th century was an act of profound skill, deep intuition, and, let's be honest, a fair amount of hopeful guesswork. Without the aid of a magnetic compass, which wouldn't arrive in Europe for another few centuries, or the complex charts and sextants of later eras, Viking navigators had to read the world around them with a clarity and intimacy that we can barely imagine. Their primary tool was the sun. On a clear day, the sun was a reliable, if rudimentary guide. They knew that at midday, the sun would be at its highest point in the sky and would be due south. By observing its position in the morning and afternoon, they could get a rough sense of east and west. They developed a simple but clever tool to help with this: the sun compass. This was a wooden disc with a central pin, or gnomon. By tracking the shadow cast by the pin at different times of the day in a known location, say their home fjord, they could scribe a series of curves onto the disc. At sea, by floating this disc in a bucket of water to keep it level and turning it until the tip of the gnomon's shadow touched the correct curve for that time of day, they could accurately determine the cardinal directions. It was a form of analog computing, a way of carrying the memory of the sun's path from their homeland out into the unknown. This also allowed them to have a sense of their latitude. They knew that the height of the midday sun changed depending on how far north or south you were. By measuring the length of the gnomon's shadow at noon, they could determine if they were maintaining their latitude, sailing due east or west, which was crucial for making reliable landfalls on long transatlantic voyages, like the one to Iceland or Greenland. But what about when it was cloudy? The North Atlantic is famously overcast, and the sun could disappear for days or even weeks at a time. This is where the legends and the science get interesting. The sagas speak of a Solarstein, a sunstone. For a long time, this was dismissed as a mythical fantasy. But modern science has suggested a plausible candidate, a type of calcite crystal known as Iceland spar, which is remarkably transparent and fairly common in Scandinavia. This crystal has a peculiar property called birefringence. When you look through it, light splits into two rays. If you look at a light source, like the sky, and rotate the crystal, there is one position where the two images you see through it have equal brightness. This position points directly to the location of the sun, even if it is hidden behind thick clouds or has dipped just below the horizon. It works by detecting the polarization of sunlight, something our own eyes cannot do. Imagine a grizzled navigator, a man named Hrafn, which means raven, his eyes squinting against the gray light. The sun has been gone for 3 days. The crew is anxious, feeling lost in an endless expanse of gray water and gray sky. But Hrafn is calm. He pulls a small, milky white crystal from a leather pouch. Holding it up to the brightest part of the sky, he slowly rotates it, his brow furrowed in concentration, until the two fuzzy images inside the stone align perfectly. He makes a small mark on the ship's railing. "South is there," he says, his voice low and certain. It must have seemed like pure magic to the rest of the crew, a secret conversation between the navigator and the hidden sun. When the sun and stars were obscured, they relied on other, more subtle clues. They became masters of reading the environment. They could read the waves, for instance. The prevailing winds in the Atlantic create a long, rolling swell that is far more regular and predictable than the choppier waves created by local weather. Even in a storm, a skilled navigator could feel the direction of this deep swell through the motion of the ship, giving him a constant, if approximate, sense of direction. They were also expert observers of wildlife. Certain species of birds, like gannets and guillemots, feed far out at sea but must return to land to roost. Seeing them flying purposefully in one direction in the evening was a sure sign that land lay that way. The type of bird also mattered. Seeing a puffin meant you were getting close to shore. Seeing a shag meant you were very close indeed. They would even carry their own birds on board. The sagas tell of a famous navigator named Floki Vilgertherson, one of the first to intentionally sail to Iceland, who took 3 ravens with him. When he thought he was getting close to land, he would release a raven. The first one flew back towards the Faroe Islands from where they had come. He sailed on. The second raven circled and landed back on the ship, seeing no land in any direction. He sailed on further. The third raven he released flew purposefully northwest and did not return. Floki followed it, and sure enough, he made landfall in Iceland. It was a beautifully simple and effective form of biological navigation. They also paid attention to the color and temperature of the water, the presence of driftwood or seaweed, and even the smell of the air, which can carry the scent of land, of vegetation and soil, for many miles out to sea. This incredible array of techniques, from the quasi-scientific sun compass to the intuitive reading of a bird's flight, allowed them to turn the terrifying, featureless void of the ocean into a landscape rich with clues and meaning. It was a mental map built from generations of experience that they carried in their heads. The daily routine on a longship was dictated by 2 things, the wind and the sun. There was no clock to mark the hours, only the slow arc of the sun across the sky and the changing of the light. The day would begin before dawn, with the changing of the watch. Men who had been sleeping would be roused, stiff and cold, to take over from those who had been working through the night. The first task was always the same. Check the ship, check the rigging, check the sail for any tears, and, of course, bail the bilge. The cold, sloshing water in the bottom of the boat was a constant reminder of their precarious situation. If the wind was favorable, the day could be relatively easy. The great square sail would be trimmed to catch the breeze, and the ship would surge forward with a satisfying hiss. In these conditions, the main job was steering. This was done with a large side rudder, or steerboard, from which we get our word, starboard, mounted on the right side of the ship near the stern. It took considerable strength and skill to hold the ship on course, especially in a heavy sea. The men not on steering duty would busy themselves with endless maintenance, mending ropes, patching the sail, sharpening their weapons, or perhaps carving a new handle for a tool. There might be time for a game of Hanefa Tafel, a strategic board game, a bit like chess, or for a storyteller to recount one of the great sagas, his voice rising and falling with the tales of gods and heroes, a welcome distraction from the vast emptiness of the ocean. But if the wind died, the character of the day changed completely. A calm sea, which might seem peaceful to us, was a source of frustration and dread for a Viking sailor. It meant the sail was useless, and the ship was dead in the water. This is when the real work began. The command would be given to ship the oars. The long, heavy sweeps of pine or ash would be run out through the oar ports, and the men would take their seats on their sea chests, and then they would row. Rowing a longship was not a gentle paddle on a lake. It was a grueling, physically punishing marathon. The oars were long and heavy, and pulling them through the water hour after hour was exhausting. The rhythm was everything. The lead oarsman would set the pace, and all the others would follow, their bodies moving in a synchronized, hypnotic motion. Backs would strain, hands would blister, and sweat would pour, even in the cold air. They would row in shifts, one side of the ship resting while the other worked. But even the rest periods were short. On a long, windless stretch, this could go on for days. It was a brutal test of stamina, turning men into living engines, their only fuel a meager diet of dried fish and weak ale. The only sounds would be the rhythmic grunt of the men, the splash of the oars, and the steady, monotonous creak of the oarlocks. It's in these moments of calm that the sheer scale of their task becomes apparent. The tiny ship, propelled only by human muscle, crawling at a snail's pace across an immense, indifferent ocean. Food, such as it was, would be eaten on the go. There was no designated mealtime. A man might grab a piece of stockfish from a sack and chew on it while he worked, or take a swig of ale from a shared waterskin. There was no fire on board for cooking. An open flame on a wooden ship filled with tar and dry timber was a risk no one was willing to take. Sometimes, they might have a sandbox, a stone-lined box filled with sand, on which a small, carefully tended fire could be lit to heat a pot of porridge or stew. But this was a luxury, only possible in the calmest of weather. For the most part, the food was cold, hard, and salty. The monotony of the diet must have been as draining as the physical labor. The same taste, the same texture, day after day, week after week. It's a small detail, but one that speaks volumes about the hardship. Imagine the simple, profound joy of making landfall and tasting something, anything else. A piece of fresh-baked bread, a roasted seabird, even a handful of wild berries would have been a feast of unimaginable luxury. Sleep, as we've seen, was a precious and fleeting commodity. The crew was divided into watches, or vact, ensuring that the ship was manned at all times. This meant sleep was fragmented. You might get a few hours of rest, huddled under the cheld, before being woken for your turn at the steering oar or on lookout duty. The constant motion, the cold, the damp, the noise, all of it conspired against deep restorative sleep. The men would have existed in a state of perpetual fatigue, their bodies and minds worn down by the relentless demands of the sea, and yet they endured. This routine, this cycle of work and rest, of wind and oar, was the pulse of their journey. It was a life stripped to its bare essentials. Stay afloat, stay on course, and keep moving forward. It was a brutal existence, but within its harsh rhythms, a powerful camaraderie was forged. These men relied on each other completely. The life of every man on board depended on the skill of the navigator, the strength of the rowers, and the vigilance of the lookout. They were a single organism, a band of brothers bound together by shared hardship and a shared dream of the shores that lay somewhere beyond the horizon. The food and water situation on a Viking ship was a constant, low-level source of misery and a significant contributor to the brutality of the life. It wasn't just about hunger and thirst. It was about the slow, grinding erosion of health and morale that came from a diet of extreme monotony and poor nutrition. Let's return to the stockfish. To us, it sounds like a historical curiosity. To a Viking sailor, it was the taste of survival. Imagine taking a piece of this fish, which had the texture and hardness of a wooden plank. You couldn't just bite into it. You would have to hammer it with the pommel of your knife to break off a piece, then slowly, laboriously, chew on the tough, fibrous strands until they softened enough to be swallowed. The taste would be overwhelmingly salty, a saltiness that would parch your throat and leave you craving water, which was itself a precious, rationed commodity. This was your primary source of protein, the fuel for hours of back-breaking rowing. There was no pleasure in it. It was simply fuel. Sometimes they might have had skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to a thick yogurt, which could last for some time in barrels or hard cheeses. But the bulk of the calories came from this salty, unyielding fish and from the equally uninspiring hardtack, a simple, unleavened biscuit of flour and water baked until it was rock hard. It was notorious for being infested with weevils after a few weeks at sea, a source of grim humor for sailors for centuries. The old joke was to tap the biscuit on the table before you ate it, to knock the insects out. A more cynical sailor might say the weevils were a welcome addition of protein. The reliance on ale over water was a practical choice, but one with its own set of problems. The low-alcohol brew, or sfagdrika, was microbially safer than water stored for long periods, which could easily become a breeding ground for dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. The fermentation process killed most of the harmful bacteria. However, as we noted, ale is a diuretic. It makes you urinate more, leading to a net loss of fluid from your body. So while you are quenching your immediate thirst, you are also contributing to a state of chronic, low-level dehydration. On a hot day, with men sweating profusely from rowing, this could become a serious danger, leading to heat exhaustion, confusion, and weakness. The water they did carry, stored in wooden casks, would have been a precious resource. doled out carefully by the captain. After weeks at sea, it would have tasted foul. The wood of the cask would leach tannins into it, turning it brown and bitter, and algae and slime would begin to grow. A common sailor's trick throughout the ages was to add a splash of alcohol or vinegar to the water to make it more palatable, to kill the taste of the slime. So your choices were weak, dehydrating ale, or slimy, bitter water. Neither was particularly appealing. The ever-present threat of scurvy cast a long shadow over every voyage. The Vikings would not have understood it in terms of vitamin C, but they knew its symptoms all too well. They knew that on long journeys away from land, men would begin to sicken and die from this strange disease. They may have had some empirical understanding of its prevention. The sagas mention that on the journey to Vinland, Leif Erikson and his crew found grapes, which they used to make wine. While the story focuses on the naming of the land, it's possible that the consumption of fresh fruit, even a small amount, saved them from the ravages of scurvy on their return journey. Similarly, in some parts of the Norse world, they consumed a type of edible seaweed or certain herbs like sorrel, which are high in vitamin C. A wise captain might have insisted on gathering such plants whenever they made landfall, even if he didn't know precisely why it worked, only that it did. But on the open sea, there was no remedy. You could only watch as your shipmate, a strong man you had shared a joke with a week earlier, grew weak and listless, his gums bleeding, his body covered in dark splotches. It was a terrifyingly random-seeming affliction, a curse from the sea itself. Think about the psychological effect of this diet. Food is one of life's great comforts. A good meal can lift the spirits and create a sense of community. The Vikings were denied this. Their mealtimes were solitary, functional affairs. There was no communal pot to gather around, no shared loaf of warm bread. Each man chewed his own piece of hard fish, lost in his own thoughts. The lack of variety, the constant, overpowering taste of salt, the gnawing feeling of a stomach that was never quite full, it all added to the grinding misery of the voyage. It's a testament to their incredible mental fortitude that they could endure this for months on end. It also makes you appreciate the descriptions of feasting in the sagas in a whole new light. When a hero returns from a voyage and the skalds sing of a great feast with roasted pork, fresh bread, and horns overflowing with strong mead, it wasn't just a description of a party. It was the description of heaven. It was the absolute, polar opposite of the life they had just endured. It was warmth, abundance, and flavor, a reward that was as much about satisfying the soul as it was about filling the belly. The promise of that feast, the memory of the last one, might have been just enough to keep a man going as he gnawed on another piece of fish that tasted like a salty shingle, the gray waves stretching out to every horizon. The dangers faced by a Viking sailor were numerous and ever-present, ranging from the awesome, impersonal fury of nature to the sudden, brutal violence of man. The most constant and feared threat was, of course, the weather. A storm at sea in a longship was an experience of pure, primal terror. Let's try to build that scene. It doesn't start suddenly. It begins with a change in the air, a subtle shift in the color of the light. The sky in the west takes on a bruised, greenish-gray color. The long, gentle ocean swell that has been rocking the ship for days begins to grow steeper and more confused as a new wind pattern imposes itself. The experienced sailors, men who have spent their lives on the water, would see these signs, and a quiet, efficient urgency would take over the ship. The command would be given to lower the sail. Wrestling the huge, heavy woolen sail down in a rising wind was a frantic, dangerous struggle. A flapping corner of the sail could strike a man with enough force to break a bone or knock him unconscious. The mast itself might be lowered and secured, reducing the ship's profile to the wind. The precious cargo, and more importantly, the men themselves, would be lashed to the thwarts and railings. And then, you wait. The wind arrives first, not as a breeze, but as a physical blow, a high-pitched shriek through the rigging that seems to tear the air apart. The sea, which moments ago was merely choppy, is whipped into a frenzy of white-capped peaks, and then the waves begin to build. Not waves as you might imagine them on a beach, but moving mountains of dark water, their faces streaked with foam. The longship, so fast and graceful in calm seas, is now a toy at the mercy of immense forces. It would climb the face of a wave, the prow pointing towards the angry sky, the timbers of the hull groaning in protest as the ship flexed under the strain. For a heart-stopping moment, you would be balanced on the crest, with a terrifying view of the maelstrom all around you, before the ship would slide sickeningly down the other side, plunging into the trough with a bone-jarring crash that sent a shower of icy spray across the entire deck. Water would pour over the sides, not as splashes but as solid green sheets that submerged the deck. The bailing would become a desperate, frantic race against the ocean itself. Men would be working in waist-deep, freezing water, their movements clumsy and slow, scooping and heaving, their muscles screaming in protest, knowing that if they stopped, the ship would founder. The noise would be deafening, the roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, the groaning of the wood, and perhaps the shouted prayers of the men to Thor for strength, or to Njord, the god of the sea, for mercy. In the middle of it all, the steersman would be fighting a heroic battle, using all his strength and skill to keep the ship's prow pointed into the waves, knowing that if they were caught broadside by one of these behemoths, the ship would be rolled over and swamped in an instant. This could go on for hours, or even for days. It was the ultimate endurance test, a battle against an enemy that could not be fought, only survived. Many did not. A single cracked plank, a snapped mast, a moment of inattention at the rudder. Any of these could doom a ship and all her crew to a cold, anonymous death in the depths. Beyond the weather, there was the insidious, creeping danger of the cold itself. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant companions on these voyages. A man constantly soaked in freezing seawater, wearing damp woolen clothes in a biting wind, would see his body temperature begin to drop. His movements would become clumsy, his thoughts confused. He might start to shiver uncontrollably, and then, ominously, the shivering might stop as his body ran out of energy. He would feel a strange, paradoxical sense of warmth and drowsiness, a lethal temptation to simply lie down and sleep. It was up to his shipmates to recognize the signs, to huddle around him, to share their body heat, to slap him awake, to keep him alive. Frostbite was more localized but no less dangerous. Fingers, toes, ears, and noses, numb with cold, could freeze solid without the sailor even realizing it. The frozen tissue would die, turning black and necrotic. If infection set in, it could lead to a slow, agonizing death. Even if you survived, you could be left maimed for life. A man with missing fingers, a constant reminder of the price the sea demanded. And then there were the human dangers. The sea was not an empty highway. It was a contested space, a hunting ground. A Viking ship, laden with goods from a trading voyage or silver from a raid, was a tempting target for other Vikings. Not all Norsemen were allies. The world was a patchwork of petty chieftains and rival clans, and piracy was rampant. A strange sail on the horizon was a source of immediate alarm. Was it friend or foe? You would watch it draw closer, trying to make out the carvings on its prow or the pattern on its sail. A sudden attack could come at any time. Another longship could pull alongside, its crew screaming war cries, grappling hooks flying through the air to lash the two ships together. The encounter would devolve into a chaotic, brutal melee on the pitching decks. It was close quarters fighting at its most savage, with axes, swords, and spears in a confined space where there was no room to retreat and nowhere to hide. A slip on the wet deck, a moment's hesitation, and it was over. Even if you were victorious, you would be left with dead and wounded shipmates, a damaged ship, and the grim task of cleaning up the carnage, all while still in the middle of a hostile ocean. The rewards of a successful voyage were great, but the risks were absolute. Every time a sailor pushed his ship out from the shore, he knew, with a certainty that we can scarcely comprehend, that he might never see land again. This quiet acceptance of profound risk was the very definition of the Viking spirit. The daily routine at sea, particularly the act of rowing, was a crucible that forged the physical and mental endurance of a Viking crew. It's easy to say, they rowed, but it's difficult to truly convey the sheer, soul-crushing labor involved. The oars on a vessel like the Gokstad ship, a famous archaeological find, were over 5 meters long. They were not light. Each oar was a heavy lever of wood, and moving it against the resistance of the water required a coordinated effort of the back, legs, and arms. It was a full-body workout of the most grueling kind. Now, imagine doing that for 8, 10, or 12 hours a day, fueled by nothing more than dried fish and a profound sense of duty. The rhythm was set by a lead oarsman, who might chant or sing to keep everyone in time. This wasn't just for morale, it was for efficiency. A crew rowing in perfect unison could move the ship at a steady 3 to 4 knots, a respectable pace in a dead calm. A crew that was out of sync was just wasting energy, their oars clashing, the ship lurching inefficiently. The physical toll was immense. The hands of every man would be covered in a thick layer of calluses, which would frequently split and bleed, the salt water stinging in the open wounds. Their backs would be a constant landscape of aching muscles. The repetitive motion would put immense strain on the joints of the shoulders, elbows, and wrists. It was a life of chronic pain, a pain that you simply had to learn to live with, to push through. There were no sick days on a longship. Unless you were grievously wounded or dying, you were expected to take your place at the oar. This shared suffering was a powerful bonding agent. The man sitting in front of you, his back straining with the same rhythm as yours, was your brother in this ordeal. You depended on his strength, and he on yours. A man who flagged, who couldn't keep up the pace, was letting down the entire crew, slowing their progress towards land, or food, or safety. The social pressure to perform, to pull your weight, must have been enormous. Let's imagine a specific day. The wind has been absent for 2 full days. The ship is somewhere in the middle of the North Sea, between Norway and the Shetlands. Land is just a memory and a hope. The sky is a flat, featureless gray. The sea is like oil. A young sailor, let's call him Finn again, is on his first long voyage. His dreams of glorious raids and gleaming silver have evaporated, replaced by the raw, blistered reality of his hands and the burning fire in his shoulders. He sits on his sea chest, his world narrowed to the 10 feet of planking around him. He sees the back of the man in front, a veteran named Rolf, whose muscles move with a practiced, efficient economy that Finn cannot yet match. He hears the rhythmic splash and pull, the grunt of exertion from 50 other men, the steady creak of the wood. His mind drifts. He thinks of the smell of his mother's stew, the feeling of soft moss under his feet in the forest back home, the sound of a dog barking, anything to escape the monotony. Rolf, without turning his head, speaks in a low voice. "Keep the rhythm, boy. Don't think about the pain. Think about the ale we'll drink in Kirkwall." It's a small thing, a few gruff words, but it's enough. It pulls Finn back to the present, reminds him of the goal, reminds him he is part of a collective effort. He grips the oar tighter and falls back into the rhythm, his pain momentarily forgotten, replaced by a grim determination. This monotony was broken by small rituals and the constant need for vigilance. The lookout, perched at the prow or the stern, had a job that was less physically demanding but required intense concentration. His eyes would be constantly scanning the horizon, a 360-degree sweep, looking for the faintest smudge that could be land, the glint of a distant sail, or the telltale shape of a whale, which they believed could be dangerous to a ship. A whale, or haveler, was a creature of awe and fear. They were too large to be hunted from a longship, and there were tales of them smashing ships to pieces. Seeing one surface near the boat, its great eyes seeming to look right at you, would have been a moment of profound, heart-stopping awe. The steersman, too, had a critical role. He was the nerve center of the ship, feeling the subtle shifts in the water and the wind, making constant small adjustments to the steerboard to keep the vessel on its intended course. This wasn't a job for just anyone. It required experience, strength, and an intuitive feel for the ship's behavior. The captain, or steermaster, literally, the steerman or leader, would have been the most experienced navigator and sailor on board. His authority would have been based not on inherited rank, but on proven competence. The men followed him because they trusted his skill to get them there and back alive. His word was law, his judgment final. He decided when to row and when to sail, when to seek shelter and when to press on. The lives of the entire crew rested on his shoulders, a burden as heavy as any oar. And so the days would pass, a blur of gray sea, and gray sky, of aching muscles and gnawing hunger, a routine of brutal simplicity. It was this grinding, unglamorous reality that separated the boys from the men, the dreamers from the sailors. It was the price of admission to the Viking world. Sleeping arrangements on a longship were, like everything else, basic, communal, and brutally uncomfortable. The concept of a bed, of a private, soft space for rest, simply did not exist. At the end of a long day of rowing or sailing, as the light faded, the crew would prepare for the night. As mentioned, the large, square woolen sail was often unbent from the yardarm and repurposed as a communal tent, the tjeld. This heavy, greasy, and likely lice-infested sheet of wool was stretched over a ridgepole that ran down the center of the ship, creating a long, low tent-like structure. It offered some protection from the dew and the wind, but it would have been claustrophobic and stuffy, trapping the smells of 50 unwashed men within its confines. Underneath this makeshift roof, the men would arrange their sleeping gear. Each man had what was called a huthfat, a sleeping bag of sorts, usually made from sheepskin or cowhide, with the fleece or fur turned inwards for insulation. This, combined with their all-purpose woolen cloak, was their entire bedding. They would sleep on the hard wooden deck, using their sea chests as a sort of pillow or headrest. The space was incredibly cramped. The men would lie side by side, packed together like fish in a barrel. This was not for camaraderie, but for survival. Huddled together, they shared body heat, a crucial defense against the penetrating night chill of the North Atlantic. Imagine trying to fall asleep in such conditions. You are lying on a hard, unyielding surface. The ship is in constant motion, a relentless rocking and pitching that your body never fully gets used to. You can feel the cold seeping up from the deck planks. The man next to you is snoring. Another is muttering in his sleep. The air is thick and stale. Through the gaps in the tjeld, you can hear the rush of the water just inches from your head, a constant reminder of the thin layer of wood separating you from the cold, black depths. It would not have been a deep, restful sleep. It would have been a shallow, fitful doze, a state of semi-consciousness, always aware of the ship's movement and the surrounding sounds. The division of the crew into watches meant that this already poor sleep was fragmented. A ship could not be left to sail itself. Someone always had to be awake. Typically, the crew would be divided into 2 or 3 watches. If you were on the first watch of the night, you might work for several hours after dusk before being relieved. You would then crawl into your huthfat, trying to snatch a few hours of sleep before your next watch began in the pre-dawn hours. This system, known as polyphasic or biphasic sleep, was common for sailors for centuries. It meant that a Viking sailor likely never had more than 3 or 4 consecutive hours of sleep at any given time during a voyage. The cumulative effect of this sleep deprivation, combined with the hard physical labor and poor nutrition, would have been debilitating. Reaction times would slow, judgment would become impaired, and moods would fray. It's a wonder that discipline could be maintained at all. Tempers must have flared easily in such close, uncomfortable quarters. A dispute over a piece of food, a perceived slight, or simple irritation from lack of sleep could escalate quickly. The captain's authority and the strong bonds of the Shield brothers were essential to keeping these tensions from boiling over into violence. Let's not forget the pests. A wooden ship filled with food stores and people was an ideal home for all manner of vermin. Lice were a certainty, living in the seams of clothing and in the woolen cloaks and sleeping bags. They would have been a constant source of irritation and itching. Rats and mice would have inevitably come aboard with the supplies, scurrying through the bilge, fouling food stores, and spreading disease. There was no escaping them. They were just another part of the miserable ecosystem of the ship. And yet, within this picture of discomfort and exhaustion, there could be moments of strange beauty. Imagine being on watch in the middle of the night. The rest of the crew is asleep under the tjeld. The sea is calm, and a full moon is out, casting a silver path across the black water. The only sounds are the gentle creak of the rudder and the soft whisper of the sail. The sky above is a vast dome of brilliant stars, more stars than you could ever see from land, unpolluted by any other light. In that moment, you are utterly alone, a tiny, silent witness to the immense, silent majesty of the cosmos. Or perhaps you would see the eerie, shifting curtains of the northern lights, the Bifrost of legend, dancing in the sky, a sight that must have filled the sailors with a mixture of awe and superstitious dread. These moments of quiet profundity, of connection to the vastness of the world, might have been a kind of compensation for the hardship. They were a reminder of what they were there for, to see what lay beyond the horizon, to travel roads that few had ever traveled, to be at the very edge of the known world. Then, your watch would end, and you would crawl back into your smelly sleeping bag, the memory of the stars already fading as you succumbed to a brief, troubled sleep. The cultural status and the rewards that awaited a successful sailor were the powerful engines driving men to endure such unimaginable hardships. The why is just as important as the how. For a young man in 9th century Scandinavia, society offered a limited number of paths. You could be a farmer, tied to the same piece of land your entire life, your existence dictated by the seasons and the success of the harvest. It was an honorable life, but often a poor and circumscribed one. Land was the primary measure of wealth, and it was finite. Due to the system of inheritance, younger sons often found themselves with little or no land of their own, facing a future as a farmhand on their older brother's property. The sea offered an alternative. It offered a chance to break free from this rigid social structure, to write your own story. The sea was a path to wealth, fame, and social mobility. A successful voyage, whether for trade or for raid, could change a man's life overnight. Let's consider the rewards of a raid. The terrified accounts from English or Frankish monasteries paint a picture of mindless, savage destruction. And while the violence was undoubtedly real and brutal, from the Viking perspective, it was a calculated economic activity. Monasteries were targeted not out of a specific hatred for Christianity, but because they were undefended and incredibly wealthy. They were the banks of the early Middle Ages, filled with gold chalices, silver reliquaries, embroidered silks, and illuminated manuscripts. For a crew of 50 men who had risked their lives crossing the North Sea, the plunder from a single successful raid could represent a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. When the longship returned to its home fjord, its sea chests heavy with silver and gold, the crew would be greeted as heroes. The chieftain who sponsored the voyage would take his share, but the rest would be divided among the crew according to their status and contribution. A common sailor, a landless younger son, might suddenly find himself with enough silver to buy his own farm, to attract a good wife, to build his own longhouse. He was no longer dependent on his family's fortunes. He had made his own. This new wealth was not just about material comfort, it was about status. He had proven his courage, his skill, and his luck. He was a Drengr, a good and honorable man, a man to be respected and listened to in the councils of the village. Trade offered a different, though equally transformative, path to wealth. A Viking merchant sailing his Nar to the east, down the great rivers of Russia to Byzantium, or to the west, to the markets of Dublin or York, could engage in incredibly lucrative commerce. He might trade Scandinavian goods like furs, amber, walrus, ivory, and slaves for exotic luxuries unavailable at home. Fine Frankish swords, beautiful glass beads, wine, pottery, and, most importantly, silver dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate. The sheer volume of Arabic silver found in Viking hoards across Scandinavia is staggering. It testifies to a vast and sophisticated trade network that connected the frozen north with the heart of the Islamic world. A successful merchant, a man like Ottar of Hålogaland, whose journey to England was recorded at the court of King Alfred the Great, could become immensely powerful and influential. He was a man of the world, a connector of cultures. His wealth built on knowledge and enterprise rather than on the edge of an axe. He brought not just goods, but stories and ideas back with him, broadening the horizons of his community. The reward was also fame. The Vikings lived in an oral culture. The greatest deeds were not written down in books, but were preserved in poems and sagas, recited by skalds around the longhouse fire on long winter nights. To be the subject of such a poem, to have your name and your deeds remembered and celebrated for generations to come, was a form of immortality. A man who led a daring voyage, who discovered a new land, or who won a great victory at sea, would achieve this kind of fame. His story would become part of the collective memory of his people. This desire for orðstír, for a good name and reputation that would outlive you, was a powerful motivator. It was better to die a glorious death at sea, your name immortalized in song, than to live a long, anonymous life on a small farm and be forgotten. This is the ethos that breathes through the sagas. When a hero faces overwhelming odds, he often does so with a kind of cheerful fatalism, knowing that even in death, his fame is secure. So when a sailor like our young Finn stared out at the endless gray ocean, he wasn't just seeing a terrifying void. He was seeing a field of opportunity. It was a place where he could literally and figuratively make his fortune. The salt spray on his face was the price of ambition. The blisters on his hands were the currency of social advancement. The gnawing hunger in his belly was a temporary state, to be replaced by the glory of the feast upon his return. The brutality of the life was real, but it was matched by the brilliance of the prize. It was this powerful equation of risk and reward that pushed the longships out of the fjords and across the map of the known world. The navigation techniques of the Vikings, while impressive, were far from foolproof, and the margin for error was perilously thin. A few days of overcast sky, a persistent fog, or a simple miscalculation could have deadly consequences. Getting lost at sea was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. A ship that missed its intended landfall, say the Faroe Islands on the way to Iceland, would find itself in the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic, with no landmarks and dwindling supplies. The crew could only sail on, hoping to stumble upon land before their food and water ran out. The sagas are filled with accounts of such voyages gone wrong. The story of the discovery of Greenland, for example, is born from a navigational error. A Norwegian named Gunnbjorn Ulfsson, sailing from Norway to Iceland, was blown far off course by a storm. When the storm cleared, he sighted a new, unknown coastline, the coast of Greenland. He didn't land, but he returned to Iceland with the tale, which later inspired Eric the Red to seek out this new land. It was a lucky mistake. For every Gunnbjorn who accidentally discovered a new continent, there were likely many others whose mistake led them only to starvation and a watery grave, their stories untold. The psychological pressure on the navigator, the styrmaður, must have been immense. He held the lives of the entire crew in his hands. Every decision he made was a gamble. Imagine his anxiety during a long stretch of fog, when the world shrinks to a few dozen yards of gray mist around the ship. He has nothing to go on but the feel of the swell and his own dead reckoning, his mental calculation of their speed and direction. He has to project an aura of confidence, of certainty, even when his own heart is filled with doubt. The crew looks to him for reassurance. Any sign of hesitation on his part could lead to panic and a breakdown of discipline. He is a lonely figure, set apart by the weight of his responsibility. It's a classic leadership scenario, not unlike a modern CEO trying to navigate a market downturn or a general planning a difficult campaign. The tools are different, but the human drama of high-stakes decision-making under uncertainty is timeless. Let's consider the danger of coastal navigation. While sailing within sight of a coastline might seem safer than being on the open ocean, it presented its own set of hazards. Coastlines are rarely smooth and welcoming. They are often fringed with hidden rocks, treacherous reefs, and unpredictable currents. A sudden onshore wind could drive a ship towards a lee shore, a shoreline that is downwind. In such a situation, a sailing ship is in grave danger. It cannot easily sail away from the coast against the wind. If the wind is too strong, even rowing might not be enough to prevent the ship from being driven onto the rocks and smashed to pieces. The annals of maritime history are filled with such disasters. For a Viking longship, with its shallow draft, there was also the risk of running aground on sandbars or in shallow estuaries. While this same shallow draft was an advantage for beaching the vessel, an unintentional grounding on a falling tide could leave the ship stranded and vulnerable, a sitting duck for any hostile locals who might happen upon it. A successful coastal navigator needed an intimate, detailed knowledge of the waters he was sailing, a mental map of every headland, every bay, and every hidden danger. This knowledge was a valuable commodity, passed down from one generation to the next. often described in poetic but practical sailing directions. Sail west from Hernar for a day and a night, keeping the mountains to starboard, until you see the 3 islands that look like sleeping seals. This was the GPS of the Viking Age, a story map whispered from one sailor to another. And even with the best navigator and a fair wind, disaster could still strike in the form of a sudden, catastrophic failure of the ship itself. The mast, under the immense pressure of a full sail and a strong wind, could snap. The steerboard, the single point of control, could break loose from its moorings, leaving the ship unsteerable and at the mercy of the waves. Or the hull itself, constantly flexing and working in the sea, could spring a major leak, a plank giving way under the strain. In such a crisis, it was all hands on deck. The crew would have to work with desperate speed to make repairs, using whatever materials they had on hand. A torn sail would be frantically stitched back together. A broken oar would be splinted. A leak might be temporarily patched from the inside with a wedge of wood and cloth. But major structural damage on the open ocean was often a fatal blow. The men could only cling to the wreckage or try to fashion a crude raft, their chances of survival dwindling with every passing hour. It's a shocking thought. The vessel that was their home, their weapon, and their hope could, in an instant, become their tomb. This inherent fragility, this constant proximity to disaster, shaped the Norse worldview. It fostered a sense of fatalism, a belief in word or fate. You could be the most skilled sailor, the bravest warrior, but your destiny was ultimately in the hands of the Norns, the mythical weavers of fate. This didn't lead to passivity, but to a kind of defiant courage. If your time was to come, it was better to meet it head-on, with courage and honor, than to cower in fear. This mindset was perhaps the most essential piece of survival equipment a Viking sailor carried with him. The social dynamics on board a longship were a complex and fascinating blend of rigid hierarchy and egalitarian cooperation. In a society so conscious of rank and status, the ship was a unique environment where a man's worth was judged not by his lineage or the size of his farm, but by his practical skills and his contribution to the voyage. The captain, or steermaster, held ultimate authority. His commands had to be obeyed without question, especially in moments of crisis. A storm or a battle was no time for a committee meeting. His authority, however, was not absolute or divinely ordained. It was earned. He was typically the owner or co-owner of the ship and the one who had initiated the voyage. He was followed because he was respected, because he had a track record of success, because the crew trusted his judgment to bring them wealth, and more importantly, to bring them home. A captain who proved incompetent, who repeatedly made poor decisions, or who endangered the crew unnecessarily, would quickly lose that respect. On a future voyage, men would simply refuse to sail with him. His reputation was his most valuable asset. Below the captain was a core group of experienced warriors and sailors, the herdmen or hearth troop, who might be his close relatives or sworn shield brothers. These were the veterans, the professional fighting men, who formed the heart of the crew. They would have had the best equipment and would have taken the lead in any combat situation. Then there were the ordinary sailors, the carlar, free farmers and younger sons seeking their fortune. While lower in status, they were not serfs or slaves. They were partners in the enterprise. Most Viking crews operated on a share system. The profits of the voyage, whether from trade or plunder, were divided amongst the crew after the captain and any other investors had taken their predetermined share. This made every man on board a stakeholder in the success of the mission. It was a powerful incentive for cooperation and hard work. Your own reward was directly tied to the collective effort. This is a strikingly modern-seeming business model, a sort of floating startup company where everyone gets equity. This cooperative spirit was essential for survival. Life on the ship required constant, synchronized teamwork. The act of raising the massive sail, for instance, required dozens of men pulling in unison. Rowing, as we've seen, was the ultimate team sport. Bailing a swamped ship was a life-or-death exercise in collective action. In these moments, a man's social standing on land was irrelevant. The son of a powerful jarl pulling on a rope was no more or less important than the landless farmer pulling on the rope next to him. What mattered was strength, stamina, and a willingness to do your part. This created a powerful bond among the crew. They called each other falagi, a word which originally meant one who lays down fee, money, with another, a business partner. This term evolved into our modern word, fellow. They were a phalag, a fellowship, bound by a shared investment and shared risk. This bond, forged in the crucible of hardship, was likely stronger than any ties of kinship. These men had faced death together, had huddled together for warmth, had shared their last drops of ale. They had seen each other at their best and their worst. This created a level of trust and mutual reliance that was absolute. Of course, it wasn't always a harmonious band of brothers. Tensions and conflicts were inevitable in such a confined and stressful environment. The sagas are full of stories of disputes that turned violent. A quarrel over the division of treasure, an insult traded during a drunken evening in port, or a rivalry over a woman could lead to bloodshed. The Norsemen were a proud and prickly people, intensely sensitive to matters of honor. A man who felt his honor had been slighted was expected to seek redress, often with an axe. A wise captain had to be a skilled mediator, able to diffuse tensions and resolve disputes before they spiraled out of control. He might enforce a strict code of conduct on his ship, with harsh penalties for fighting or insubordination. He had to balance the need for discipline with the fiercely independent spirit of his crew. It was a delicate balancing act. Ultimately, the survival of the ship depended on maintaining this social cohesion. The real enemy was the sea, and any internal division only gave that enemy an advantage. The most successful crews were those who could subordinate their individual egos to the needs of the collective, who understood that on the vast and lonely ocean, their fellowship was their strongest shield. The sheer psychological endurance required of a Viking sailor is perhaps the most brutal aspect of the life, and the hardest for us to fully grasp. The physical hardships were immense, but the mental strain was constant and corrosive. Consider the sensory deprivation and overload. For weeks on end, the visual landscape was an unchanging panorama of gray or blue. The sameness of it, the lack of features, the endless horizon, could be profoundly disorienting and demoralizing. It's a phenomenon known to modern-day long-distance sailors and astronauts, the big eye or break-off phenomenon, a feeling of detachment and unreality that comes from being in a vast, featureless environment. At the same time, you were bombarded with other sensations. The constant noise of the wind and waves, the perpetual motion of the ship, the smells of bilge water and unwashed bodies. There was no peace, no quiet, no stillness. It was a relentless assault on the nervous system. Fear was a constant companion, but it was a particular kind of fear. It wasn't always the sharp, adrenalized fear of a battle or a storm. More often, it was a low-level, gnawing anxiety. The fear of the unknown. What lay over the horizon? Were the stories of monstrous sea creatures true? What kind of reception would they meet if they made landfall in a strange country? There was the fear of getting lost, of sailing on endlessly until the food ran out. There was the fear of sickness, of watching your friends die from scurvy or an infected wound, knowing there was nothing you could do. This constant, simmering anxiety had to be suppressed, pushed down, hidden behind a mask of stoic indifference. The Viking ideal of a man was one who faced his fate, good or bad, with courage and composure. Showing fear was a sign of weakness, but that doesn't mean they didn't feel it. They were human beings, not superheroes. The effort of maintaining this stoic facade, day in and day out, must have been emotionally exhausting. Boredom was another insidious enemy. When the wind was fair and the sailing was smooth, there were long stretches of time with little to do. The maintenance tasks could only fill so many hours. The rest of the time was a void that had to be filled. This is where the importance of culture came in. A man who could tell a good story, who knew the great sagas of Sigurd the Dragonslayer or Ragnar Lothbrok, was an invaluable asset to a crew. He was the ship's entertainment system. In the evenings, huddled under the cheld, his voice would transport the men away from their cold, damp reality and into a world of gods, giants, and heroes. They would listen, rapt, their own small struggles put into perspective by these epic tales. Music also played a role. Someone might have a simple flute carved from a reed or a small harp, and the sound of a familiar melody would be a profound comfort, a reminder of home. Games of chance and skill, played with dice made of bone or on carved boards like Hanefatafel, were another vital pastime. These activities were not just frivolous diversions, they were essential tools for maintaining sanity. They provided mental stimulation, fostered social interaction, and helped to mark the passage of time, which could otherwise feel like an undifferentiated continuum of misery. There was also a deep-seated homesickness, a longing for the land, which they called land sickness. After weeks at sea, the craving for solid ground, for the smell of soil and green growing things, for the taste of fresh water from a spring, would become almost a physical pain. Every sailor knows this feeling. The sea is a powerful and awe-inspiring place, but it is not our natural home. We are terrestrial creatures. The joy and relief of finally sighting land after a long voyage is a recurring theme in all maritime literature. For a Viking sailor, that first glimpse of a distant, hazy coastline must have been a moment of almost religious ecstasy. It was the end of the ordeal. It was the promise of safety, of fresh food, of a soft, dry place to sleep. It was the confirmation that the navigator's skill and their own endurance had paid off. It was, quite simply, the sight of salvation. The psychological burden would lift, replaced by a surge of elation and pride. They had done it. They had crossed the whale road and survived. This profound sense of relief is the flip side of the psychological strain. You cannot appreciate the sweetness of the shore without having first endured the bitterness of the sea. The brutality of the journey was what made the arrival so glorious. When a Viking ship made landfall after a long voyage, the first priority was often not plunder or trade, but simple replenishment and recovery. The crew would be exhausted, malnourished, and desperate for the basic comforts of land. If they landed in a friendly or uninhabited area, their first actions would be dictated by survival. They would beach the longship, pulling it up onto the shore to secure it and to allow for any necessary repairs to the hull. Then, the search for fresh water would begin. Finding a stream or a spring and drinking deeply of cold, clean, fresh water would have felt like the most profound luxury imaginable. They would light a fire, a proper, large fire, for the first time in weeks. The warmth and light would be a huge morale booster. They would set up a camp on the shore, perhaps using the ship's cheld to create a more substantial shelter than was possible on board. They would hunt for game, seabirds, seals, deer if they were available, and go fishing in the coastal waters. The prospect of eating freshly cooked meat or fish, after weeks of hard, salty stockfish, would have been cause for celebration. A feast would be held, not just to fill their bellies, but to mark the transition from the world of the sea to the world of the land. This was also a time for healing and hygiene. Men would finally have a chance to wash the accumulated grime and salt from their bodies and clothes. They would tend to their wounds, their sores, and the effects of exposure. If they were lucky enough to find edible plants known to combat scurvy, like wild berries or certain green herbs, they would gather and consume them eagerly. This period of rest and recuperation was vital. It allowed the men to regain their strength before continuing their journey or beginning the long voyage home. The ship itself would also receive a thorough overhaul. The hull would be scraped clean of barnacles and seaweed, which slowed it down. The rigging would be checked and repaired. The sail would be patched. It was like a modern-day pit stop, a chance to get the machine and its operators back into fighting shape. This practical, logistical side of Viking seafaring is often overlooked in the sagas, which tend to focus on the more dramatic moments. But these quiet periods of maintenance and recovery were just as crucial to the success of a voyage as the heroic battles. If the landfall was in an inhabited land with which they intended to trade, the approach would be very different. They would approach a known market town, like Hedeby in Denmark or Jorvik, York, in England. As a sign of peaceful intent, they would remove the carved dragon head from the prow of their ship. They would anchor and wait for permission to come ashore. Once in the market, a fascinating transformation would occur. These hardened sailors, who had just endured months of brutal hardship, would become savvy merchants. They would unload their cargo, the fine furs from the north, the amber from the Baltic, the walrus ivory from Greenland, and begin to haggle with the local traders. The scene in a Viking Age market town would have been a vibrant, chaotic, and multilingual affair. You would hear the babble of Old Norse, Old English, Frankish, and perhaps even Arabic or Greek. The smells would be a rich mixture of spices, livestock, leather, and wood smoke. For a sailor from a remote Norwegian fjord, a place like Hedeby would have been a dazzling metropolis, a window into a much larger and more complex world. Here, he could exchange his raw materials for goods of incredible craftsmanship and beauty: gleaming glassware, brightly colored pottery, fine woolen cloth, and shimmering silks from the Far East. He might trade his entire share of the voyage's profits for a single, beautifully crafted sword with a patterned welded blade, a weapon that was not only a deadly tool but also a symbol of immense prestige. And what if the landfall was hostile? If the purpose of the voyage was a raid, the approach was all about speed and surprise. They would try to use the cover of darkness or fog to get as close as possible to their target, often a wealthy but poorly defended monastery or coastal settlement. The ship would not anchor but would be driven directly onto the beach. The moment the keel ground on the sand, the crew would leap over the sides, screaming their war cries, weapons in hand. They were a terrifying sight, a band of wild-looking, bearded men, appearing as if from the sea itself. The attack would be swift and ruthless. They would overwhelm any resistance, seize anything of value: gold, silver, livestock, and people. Slaves were a hugely valuable commodity in the Viking world, and the capture of prisoners was a primary objective of many raids. The raiders would work quickly, spending as little time on shore as possible. Once they had gathered their plunder, they would retreat to the longship, push it back into the water, and disappear over the horizon as quickly as they had arrived. For the victims, it was a bewildering and terrifying event. For the Vikings, it was a high-risk, high-reward business venture, the brutal culmination of their long and arduous journey. Whether as traders, explorers, or raiders, the moment of landfall was the moment of truth, the point where the endurance test of the sea was converted into the tangible rewards of the land. The cultural impact of the Viking sailor on the world was as profound as the oceans they crossed. These were not just pirates who came and went. They were agents of change, connectors of cultures, and founders of nations. Their voyages, driven by that potent mix of land, hunger, ambition, and adventurous spirit, redrew the map of Europe and left a genetic and linguistic legacy that endures to this day. In England, the constant raids of the 9th century evolved into large-scale settlement. The great heathen army that arrived in 865 was not just a raiding force, it was an invading and colonizing one. They conquered and settled a vast swath of northeastern England, an area that came to be known as the Danelaw. Here, Norse laws, customs, and language took root. Place names across this region still bear the mark of the Vikings. Towns ending in "by", like Grimsby or Derby, from the Old Norse word for village, or Thorpe for outlying settlement, or Thwaite for clearing. Even our everyday language is peppered with their contributions. Words like sky, skin, leg, window, from Vindaga or Windai, and even they, their, and them are all gifts from the Vikings, absorbed into English from the language of the settlers. So the next time you look up at the sky, you are using a word brought to England in a longship. In France, the relentless Viking raids on the River Seine became such a problem that the Frankish king, Charles the Simple, tried a different strategy. In 911, he made a deal with a powerful Viking leader named Rollo. He granted Rollo and his men the lands around the mouth of the Seine in exchange for peace and for Rollo's conversion to Christianity and his oath of fealty. This territory became the Duchy of Normandy, the land of the Northmen. These Vikings rapidly adopted the local French language and customs, but they never lost their restless energy and military prowess. A century and a half later, in 1066, a descendant of Rollo, a man named William the Conqueror, would launch his own seaborne invasion from Normandy across the English Channel, fundamentally changing the course of English history forever. The Normans who conquered England were, in essence, French-speaking Vikings, their spirit of adventure and conquest simply repackaged. So, in a strange twist of fate, the Vikings ended up conquering England twice. To the east, Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, traveled down the great river systems of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. They were primarily traders and mercenaries, seeking the silver of the Arab world and the silks of Byzantium. They established fortified trading posts along the rivers, which grew into cities like Novgorod and Kiev. The native Slavic tribes, who were often at war with each other, came to see these organized and militarily powerful Norsemen as potential rulers. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, the Slavs invited the Rus to come and rule over them, saying, "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it." Whether this was a genuine invitation or a later justification for a conquest, the result was the same. A Rus's dynasty, the Rurikids, came to rule the land, giving their name to the country itself, Russia. These Scandinavian elites would eventually assimilate, adopting Slavic language and Orthodox Christianity, but they laid the foundations for the first unified Russian state. And in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, in Constantinople, the emperor was so impressed by the ferocity and loyalty of these northern warriors that he formed an elite bodyguard unit composed almost entirely of them, the Varangian Guard. For centuries, serving in the Varangian Guard was a highly prestigious and lucrative career path for ambitious young Scandinavians. It was the ultimate long-distance voyage, a journey to the richest city in the world to serve as the personal protectors of its emperor. And to the west, they pushed the boundaries of the known world itself. From Norway, they sailed to the Shetland and Orkney Islands, then to the Faroes. From there, they made the long and dangerous open ocean crossing to Iceland, a large, uninhabited island that they colonized in the late 9th century, creating a unique new society with a fiercely independent republican government. From Iceland, Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, led a group of colonists even further west to the massive, ice-sheeted land he shrewdly named Greenland, hoping the attractive name would entice more settlers. And from Greenland, his son, Leif Erikson, around the year 1000, sailed even further west, making landfall on the coast of North America, which he called Vinland, nearly 500 years before Columbus. They established a small, short-lived settlement there, a place now identified as Lonzo Meadows in Newfoundland. The brutal life of the Viking sailor was not just a story of personal endurance. It was the engine of a historical process that reshaped cultures, founded kingdoms, and connected the world in new and unexpected ways. Every time a longship returned home, it didn't just bring back silver or furs. It brought back knowledge, experience, and a piece of the wider world. Slowly but surely transforming Scandinavia from a remote northern backwater into a major player on the stage of medieval history. Let's take a moment to consider the ship itself, not just as a vehicle, but as a cultural object, a symbol. The longship was the absolute pinnacle of Viking technology. It was their moon rocket, their supercomputer, the one piece of sophisticated hardware that gave them a decisive edge. Its design was the culmination of centuries of experimentation and refinement, a perfect marriage of form and function. The beauty of a longship lies in its brutal efficiency. There is not a single piece of wood on it that is purely decorative, save for the removable prow. Every curve, every plank, every rivet is there for a reason, to make the ship stronger, faster, more seaworthy. It is a masterpiece of minimalist design, a tool honed to a razor's edge for its specific purpose. This deep-seated pragmatism, this focus on what works, is a core element of the Viking mindset. They were not sentimentalists. They were practical, results-oriented people, and their ship was the ultimate expression of that ethos. The ship was also a symbol of wealth and power. Owning a longship was an enormous investment. It required the felling of dozens of mature oak trees, the labor of skilled shipwrights for months, and thousands of expensive iron rivets. Only a wealthy chieftain or a successful merchant could afford to commission such a vessel. To own a ship was to broadcast your status to the world. A jarl with a fleet of longships moored in his fjord was a man to be reckoned with. His ships represented his ability to project power, to muster men, to generate wealth through trade or raid. They were a floating testament to his influence. This is why ships feature so prominently in Viking burials. The most powerful chieftains were sometimes not buried in the ground, but in their ships. The vessel was dragged ashore and placed in a large trench. The deceased would be laid out within it, surrounded by his most precious possessions, his weapons, his tools, his feasting gear, even sacrificed horses and slaves to serve him in the afterlife. The whole assemblage was then covered with a huge mound of earth and stone. This was the ultimate honor. The ship that had been the vehicle of his success in this life would be his vessel to carry him to the next. The famous Oseberg and Gokstad ship burials in Norway are stunning examples of this practice, preserving these beautiful vessels in almost perfect condition for over 1,000 years. They are not just archaeological artifacts, they are prayers made of wood and iron. The ship was woven into the very fabric of their language and imagination. In the complex, metaphorical poetry of the Skalds, the sea was called the Whale Road or the Gannet's Bath. A ship was a wave horse, a sea steed, or a fjord elk. A battle was a storm of swords. This poetic language, known as kenning, reveals a worldview where the ship was a living, breathing creature, a trusted partner in the dangerous dance with the sea. It wasn't just a collection of planks. It had a personality, a spirit. Giving the ship a name and a terrifying dragon's head prow was part of this personification. You were not just sailing a boat, you were riding a great sea serpent, a creature as wild and powerful as the ocean itself. This deep, almost mystical connection to their vessels helps to explain how they could place so much trust in them, how they could push them to the very limits of their capabilities. They believed in their ships, not just as engineers, but as partners. It's a relationship that modern people, accustomed to thinking of technology as inert and disposable, might find hard to understand. For the Viking, the longship was an extension of himself, a physical manifestation of his own courage, ambition, and restless spirit. This brings us back to the sailor himself. The man who lived this brutal life was shaped by his vessel and his voyages. A man who had crossed the North Sea had seen things that his land-bound brethren could only dream of. He had seen the world. He had survived storms, fought in battles, haggled in foreign markets. This experience would have changed him. He would have returned with a broader perspective, a new confidence, perhaps a certain world weariness in his eyes. He would have been more cosmopolitan, more adaptable, more resilient. In a way, the Viking sailor was the first truly modern European. He was a man not defined solely by his piece of land or his local community, but by his mobility, his enterprise, and his ability to navigate a complex and dangerous world. The longship was the tool that made this new kind of identity possible. It was the key that unlocked not only the coastlines of Europe, but also the potential within the human spirit to endure, to explore, and to risk everything for a glimpse of what lies beyond the horizon. The sleek, beautiful, and brutal longship was, in the end, a perfect reflection of the people who built and sailed it. As we draw this journey to a close, let us try to hold in our minds the complete picture of the Viking sailor. He is a figure of profound contradictions. He is a farmer and a pirate, a merchant and a warrior, a poet and a killer. He is a man of incredible physical endurance, capable of rowing for days on end, yet he is also a skilled craftsman and a savvy navigator. He lives a life of appalling squalor and brutality on his ship, yet he is often fastidiously clean in his personal grooming, with his iconic combs, tweezers, and ear scoops found in almost every grave. He is part of a culture that produces some of the most beautiful and intricate art of the early Middle Ages. Yet he is also capable of perpetrating acts of shocking violence. He is not a simple character. He is as complex and multifaceted as the society that produced him. To reduce him to the one-dimensional caricature of a horned, helmeted barbarian is to miss the whole story. The horns, by the way, are a complete fabrication, an invention of a 19th century costume designer for a Wagner opera. A real Viking would have found the idea of wearing horns in a battle as absurd as we would. They would get in the way, a perfect handle for your enemy to grab your head. It's a small detail, but it speaks to how much our popular image of the Vikings is a fantasy. The reality was so much more interesting. It was a life of harsh, practical choices. Why risk everything on the sea? Because the land at home was poor and crowded, and the sea offered a chance at a better life. Why raid a monastery? because it was an undefended treasure chest, and your own gods were at war with the Christian one anyway. Why sail into the unknown west? Because you had a ship that could do it, and you had heard a story of some new land, and you had the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to try. Their world was not governed by our morality. It was governed by a different code, one that valued courage, loyalty to your kin, generosity to your friends, ruthlessness to your enemies, and above all, the pursuit of a reputation that would survive your death. The brutal life of the sailor was the forge in which that reputation was hammered into shape. Let's return one last time to our young sailor, Finn, on his journey home. The voyage has been a success. The sea chests are heavy with English silver, but the crew has been thin. Some men were lost in the raid, others to a sudden squall on the return journey. Finn is no longer the wide-eyed boy who left the fjord months ago. He is thinner, harder. His face is weathered by the sun and wind, and his eyes have a distant look. His hands are a mass of calluses. He has seen men die. He has taken a life himself. He has known fear and exhaustion, and a hunger so deep it felt like it was eating him from the inside. But he has also known the exhilaration of the ship running before a strong wind, the quiet comradeship of the watch at night, and the fierce joy of victory. He is a different person. As the ship finally rounds the last headland and enters his home fjord, he sees the familiar shapes of the mountains, the plume of smoke from his own longhouse. The ordeal is over. He has survived. He has a share of silver that will allow him to buy his own patch of land, to be his own man. He has a story to tell, a story that will be told and retold around the fire. He has earned his place in the world. Was it worth it? The pain, the fear, the loss? As he looks at the shore drawing closer, at the life that now awaits him, a life he has seized for himself from the sea, he would probably say yes. The age of the Viking sailor slowly came to an end. The nations of Europe became more organized, with stronger kings, standing armies, and better coastal defenses. Raiding became a much riskier and less profitable business. At the same time, Scandinavia itself was changing. The old pagan faith gave way to Christianity, and the patchwork of petty chiefdoms consolidated into the kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The old, restless, freelance spirit of the Viking was gradually tamed and integrated into the broader European mainstream. The ships changed too. The sleek, shallow draft longship, perfect for raiding and exploration, was gradually replaced by the deeper, heavier, more cargo-friendly cog, the workhorse of late medieval trade. The era of the Viking, that unique and explosive period of expansion, drew to a close. But the legacy of the brutal life they lived on the sea never really disappeared. It lives on in the language we speak, in the places we live, in the stories we tell, and in the deep, universal human impulse to look towards the horizon and wonder what lies beyond. And so, as our own journey ends for tonight, perhaps you can let your mind drift on that quiet fjord. The longship is at rest now, its sail furled, its oars shipped. The crew is ashore, their voices carrying from the longhouse, celebrating their return. The water laps gently against the hull, the only sound in the cool night air. The brutal life is over, for now. There is only peace and the promise of rest.